Okay, so in my previous videos, I talked a lot about how to read Federal Reserve policies and how you can leverage those policies to your advantage. Also, I covered some stuff on why financial crises happen and how the next financial crisis can be triggered. Now, as you all know, Federal Reserve kind of became a famous thing even among the general public because of quantitative easing. And also, on the other side, the government bailed out a lot of companies which are seemingly too big to fail. Basically, a lot of people think of quantitative easing and bailouts as money printing scheme, which provides liquidity in the market and drives the asset prices up. And company bailouts as something which is giving free money to companies which misconducted their businesses. Now today, I wanted to talk about this quantitative easing and bailouts and explain what this actually is and how it can be good or bad to the society. Also, as part of the video, I'll be uploading a poll in the Communities tab for you to vote on whether you think bailouts or QEs are needed in this world. Please participate in this poll to see how people think about this issue. Now, bailouts is an obvious concept. It's either having the government inject a large sum of money in equity or loan with a very low rate, so the companies would survive rather than going bankrupt. But what is quantitative easing? So in simple terms, quantitative easing is a terminology used to describe the Federal Reserve purchasing bonds from the public market. As I told you earlier in my previous videos, Federal Reserve plays an important role in the market to make sure the economy operates in a stable manner. And by stable, what I mean is low unemployment rate and stable inflation. When the Federal Reserve feels like the economy is doing very bad, they would do this quantitative easing by purchasing the bonds from the market in return for cash. So basically, there's the Federal Reserve, which is the purchaser of the bonds. The bonds which are purchased by the Federal Reserve are generally U.S. Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Now, the companies which sell these bonds to the Federal Reserve are public financial institutions. Public financial institutions include the likes of JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and etc. Basically, all major banks and financial institutions are mandated to follow the Federal Reserve policies, and when the Federal Reserve is shopping these bonds, they will sell the bonds to the Federal Reserve. Now, when these financial institutions sell the bonds, and the Federal Reserve just keeps on buying them, two things happen. First thing that happens is, these financial institutions suddenly get loaded with cash. QE started in 2008 when the global financial crisis happened, and until today, they conducted 4 rounds of major QEs, including 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2020 during COVID. And in total, the Federal Reserve purchased a total of almost $9 trillion in total across the 4 QEs. So what this means is that these financial institutions are loaded with cash, and what is the primary business for these institutions? It's lending. So when these financial institutions are loaded with cash, they don't want to keep this money and not doing anything with it, but they want to earn money by lending it out. So suddenly, all financial institutions suddenly start competing each other to lend this money to anyone who walks in the door. So this is the first thing that happens. Basically, the financial institutions become loaded with cash and become super eager to lend the money to somebody. The second thing that happens is, because there's so many institutions that are willing to lend the money to corporates and individuals, it leads to a significant decrease in the interest rate. Basically, if everyone wants to lend you money at the same time, you can leverage the situation to get a lower, and even the lowest interest rate you can get out there. So money becomes extremely cheap, and all financial institutions are competing to lend the money to somebody, even at a very low rate. So that's the second thing that happens. Basically, money becomes extremely cheap, and interest rate goes down significantly. Also, bailouts aside, this is also why a lot of zombie companies, which might go bankrupt, also somehow gets saved during times like this, because they have so much access to money via the loan. Now, the misconception of quantitative easing equals money printing is not completely wrong, given in order for Federal Reserve to pay the financial institutions cash in return for the bond they purchased, they actually need the cash to pay them. So generally, this leads to a certain new money issuance activities which is required to conduct QE. Now, I want to talk about the side effects of QE. A lot of people don't like the concept of QE because it generally has the image of making the rich a lot richer and making the poor a lot poorer. Also, the concept of too big to fail stems from QE as well. So why do a lot of people hate QE? The first reason is because QE was historically used as a tool to save large corporates and financial institutions when the economy was a mess and everyone was suffering. Now, as I explained in my investment banking salary video, where I talked about how much I got paid when I was working in investment banking, these financial institutions generally pay a high salary to their employees. Also, in 2008, these investment banks were the ones who packaged mortgage loans and sold tons of derivatives to the world, which caused a financial crisis. Basically, this led to the QE having the image of a tool which is used to save the very villains who actually caused the crisis. Now, the second reason is because QE generally causes inflation. As we experienced in 2012 until today, an excessive QE leads to so much liquidity in the market that it significantly boosts people's spending power and borrowing power, leading to excessive spendings, which causes the increase in the price of goods. Basically, if there's inflation, the people who benefit from QE are the ones who already have assets. People who already own land, houses, stocks, have a diversified portfolio which would benefit from the additional liquidity in the market. There will be more demand for land and houses, and companies would also raise the price of their goods, which leads to a higher revenue and ultimately lead to a higher share price. So people who are already rich generally gets richer. Now, the financially poorer people would not benefit from any of this, and as a result, compared to the rich people, the poor people would become even poorer. Okay, now let's move on to the next topic on whether QE and bailouts are good or bad. Now, to elaborate on this topic, to help you understand better, I want to lay out two examples. First scenario is the world with the QE and bailouts in 2008, which is what actually happened. And the second scenario is the world without the QE and the bailouts in 2008, which is a hypothetical scenario. Let's think about what would have happened. Now, in the first scenario, basically, as I explained in my 2008 financial crisis video, the housing price collapsed and all corporates and financial institutions went bankrupt. Other companies like Morgan Stanley was also about to go bankrupt, so the Federal Reserve stepped in and introduced the QE and the TARP, and the government started bailing out companies. Basically, the Federal Reserve injected so much money into the system and these financial institutions that everybody in the world started thinking, oh, maybe we don't have to worry about the world collapsing, looking at how much determined the Fed and the government is. So the market sentiment calmed down and the world went back to business as usual. Now, the side effects were the following. Number one, the investment banks played a key role in crashing down the market, but were saved under the notion of too big to fail. And number two, the stock market started to rally infinitely and made the rich even richer and the poor poorer. And number three, though it didn't happen in 2008, there were a lot of inflation risk. Although nobody knows, the 2008 QE may have played a role in the 2022 inflation as well, so we can't say for sure. Now, in the second scenario, let's see what would have happened if the QE and bailouts didn't happen. Now, around 2008, financial institutions were collapsing like a domino. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Washington Mutual, Silver State Bank, Main Street Bank, and etc. So after these financial institutions and companies went bankrupt, obviously there were other financial institutions waiting in line to go bankrupt. Those companies were AIG, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, and etc. Now, if QE and bailouts didn't happen, these other companies and financial institutions would have gone bankrupt as well. This would have caused a credit crunch with no one trusting anybody and not willing to lend money to anybody. Also, people would rush to the bank to withdraw money from their bank account, given no one will be trusting the bank anymore as they'll think that it'll go bankrupt. The bank run will cause the banks to run out of liquidity and accelerate their path towards bankruptcy. Now, if nobody lends money to anyone, real companies will start going bankrupt. Those could include the likes of General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. Now, GM and Chrysler did file bankruptcy but was bailed out. What I mean is, without the Federal Reserve and the government's help, GM and Chrysler wouldn't even exist anymore. Now, if the automakers like GM and Chrysler and Ford disappear, hundreds and thousands of companies which supplies tires, batteries, leather, glass, softwares, powertrains, etc. will all most likely go bankrupt as well. Now, these kind of chain effect will have happened across all industries. I would say that in about 6 to 12 months after the occurrence of the financial crisis, unemployment rate might have gone up to 25 to 30%. Now, because so many people lost jobs and nobody hardly has any purchasing power, companies that produce necessities like cheese and milk would also go bankrupt down the road. In the midterm, practically everyone would be unemployed, and most likely people would need to buy seeds and start farming their own food and supplies. I think there could still be the government and the military, so I don't think it would turn into an absolute chaos, but that's how the world would be. Now, of course, not all of the things I laid out will happen just because of QE or bailouts didn't happen. For example, the government can freeze all the banks so that people cannot withdraw cash from the banks. So just a caveat that I'm laying out a very drastic scenario where the government and the Federal Reserve do not intervene at all. Now, from your perspective, which scenario looks better? Honestly, I can't really say one is better than the other. In the first scenario, I get the need for the Fed and the government to maintain the system, but the feeling of devastation which people would feel because of the QE and the bailouts is just quite horrible. Also, bailing out the villains of the system doesn't make any sense. It just sounds like a huge injustice and a fraud. Now, I'm trying to speak from a third person's point of view despite having worked at an investment bank for many years, but even from my perspective, it's really weird and doesn't sound fair at all. Now, in the second scenario, this is a great reset. Basically, the collapse of capitalism and back to the ancient times with people hunting and all doing manual labor to source their own supplies. This sounds extremely weird as well. We're living the life we're living right now. So we have TVs, YouTube, Instagram, emails, Starbucks, Netflix, and suddenly we go back to the world with hardly any of those. But if you think about it, if there's no value in dollar and currencies with everything falling apart altogether, it kind of sounds fair to everybody. Maybe not 100% fair for people who didn't actively participate in buying the houses or packaging mortgage loans or rating the loans at credit rating agencies. But assuming most of the people enjoyed the flourishing economy until 2008, and if the result is a great reset for everybody, I don't know, it somewhat sounds fairer than the first scenario. One caveat here is that there could still be certain asset classes which are still in value, and those are the likes of gold, given they have always been alternative form of currencies. So I can't really decide on which scenario I prefer, but you guys let me know in the comments down below and through the poll. I know there's a famous quote by Murakami Haruki, which also comes up in the movie The Big Short. The quote goes, "Everyone deep in their hearts is waiting for the end of the world to come." And I somewhat feel like I sometimes feel the same way, which kind of leads me to want the second scenario sometimes. But let me know your thoughts. Please take the poll in the community section to provide your thoughts as well. I'll be back with more videos very soon.